Devorah. Again, there are a number of themes. She starts off with Matan Torah. She then talks about the dangerous conditions that people were living with in terms of they couldn't go in open areas. Their communities were surrounded by walls. Then she praises the tribes that fought. She specifically mentions the Ephraim, Menashe, Binyamin. She singles out Zevulun and Yisachar. And then she condemns the tribes that did not participate. Ruvain, number one, Ruvain is Eber Liyardain, and she mocks Ruvain a little bit by saying, Loma Yashavta Beina Mishpasayim. Why did you sit among the sheep pens, the sheep corrals? Lishmaya Shurikos Adarim, to listen to the bleating of the flocks. And she criticizes them. She mentions Dan. Now remember, Dan is one of the Shvatim that has two different places in Eretz Yisrael. Their assigned place in Eretz Yisrael is along the Mediterranean coast. But then they conquered a city to the north. And we discussed whether that is part of Eretz Yisrael or was not part of Eretz Yisrael. But the famous phrase, when the Navi wants to say that all of the Jewish people participated. So the lashon of the pasuk is from Dan to Beersheba. So Dan is described as far north, and Beersheba, at least as a settled area. Eretz Yisrael goes south to Beersheba, but as a settled area, Beersheba was south. So that Dan is referring to Laish, which was the area that Dan conquered. But here, Devorah is referring to Dan's assigned territory, which is on the Mediterranean coast. And she says, why was Dan busy with working on its ships, right? Reuven is busy with his sheep, and Dan is busy with his ships, his boats on the Mediterranean coast, meaning each one is involved in their inyan, and they did not care about Klal Yisrael. Now, Asher is a little ambiguous, because sometimes you can't tell, is she praising or condemning? When it comes to Asher, this is Pasuk Yud Zayin, says, Asher Yashav L'chof Yamim. Asher was dwelling on the coast. Again, Asher is also a coastal area up north. V'al miftzarav yishkon. Now, miftzar comes from porates, meaning breaking, breaches, breaking. That Asher went where there were breaches. So many Mefarshim understand that that's actually a compliment, meaning to say, even though Asher was secure on the coast, Asher went to where there was a breach in Am Yisrael, where the enemy had broken through, and therefore the pashtus is Asher is being praised and the like. Okay. You do have a certain problem here, again, and I don't see any Mefarshim that really give you a mahalach. And that is, there's a lot of tribes that are not mentioned, meaning here we have the problem. She praises a small number of tribes that participated, and she criticizes a small number of tribes who refused to participate. Now the problem is, what about all the tribes that are not mentioned? Did they participate? And if they participated, why are they not singled out for praise? Did they not participate? And if that's the case, why are they not singled out for criticism? Meaning, how do you deal with the undistributed middle? I don't know. I actually don't have a terrorist. I mean, one thing that occurs to me might be, just I'll be shot, that she's not simply praising everybody who participated. She's only praising people who engaged in extraordinary heroism in the war, which means there could have been run-of-the-mill participation. So they don't get criticized, but they also don't get praised in particular because they did not do anything that was so unusual. But I don't know. I mean, I'm surprised that the Mefarshim are not omed on that. Okay, so that's the next theme, right? So the theme Matan Torah, dangers, praise of the Shvatim, and criticism of other Shvatim. So only after that does Devorah actually describe certain details of the war against Sisera that you actually do not get from the narrative, right? The narrative of the war is Perek Daled, and it's only very, very few psukim. And in Shiras Devorah, some of this narrative is elaborated upon. And Pasuk Chaf says, Min hashamayim nilchamu, hakochavim mimesilosam nilchamu im Sisra. So Devorah says the following: from the very heavens, the shamayim, there was a war. The stars in their orbits waged war against Sisera. So what does this even mean? What do we mean the stars in the heavens wage war against Sisera? That detail was not mentioned in Perek Dalet Bichlal. So there are, two ways of learning this pasuk, and they overlap really. Number one, that the reference to Kochavim is lav dafka stars, but it refers to heavenly beings, heavenly creations. And as a result, it can refer to angels. And the Medrash tells us that Sisera was not only defeated by the Jewish human army, but the angels of heaven formed a heavenly army that came down and fought against Sisera. Now, what does it mean to have a heavenly army fight against you? Do you see like angels, or is it just kind of a way that the heavenly army is invisible, it's not seen, but somehow the Jewish people were able to achieve such a remarkable success, such a remarkable hatzlacha, that it couldn't have been on their own. There was a heavenly army that was assisting them. So according to that explanation, Devorah's claim, or Devorah's statement, that the Kochavim waged war against Sisera really means a heavenly army of angels waged war against Sisera, whether we saw them or not. Now, the notion of a heavenly army of angels is not unknown in Nach. There is indeed one other narrative, at least, where this is mentioned explicitly as an army of the angels of God, and this is much, much, much later in the time of Chizkiyahu HaMelech. Remember, Chizkiyahu HaMelech was one of the righteous kings of Malchei Beis David. In fact, Chazal say he could have been Mashiach had the generation been worthy. And Chizkiyahu HaMelech was the Melech of Yehuda at the time of Sancheriv exiling the 10 tribes. And in the book of Malachim we read that after Sancheriv destroyed the kingdom of the 10 tribes, he went south to Yerushalayim, and he wanted to capture Yerushalayim. And this was a very, very dangerous time. We were very vulnerable. I mean, the Kal V'chomer, if Sancheriv could exile and destroy the 10 tribes, Kal V'chomer, Yehuda, and Shevet Binyamin, who were in the south. And indeed, Chizkiyahu fasted, Chizkiyahu prayed, Chizkiyahu davened. The Navi Yeshayahu came to give him prophecies of chizuk and comfort. But it is recorded that Sancheriv had an army of 180,000 soldiers at the walls of Yerushalayim. And that night, an army of the angels of God came and destroyed all of the 180,000 soldiers. That was the night of Pesach, one of the miracles that happened later, the first night of Pesach, was the destruction of the army of Sancheriv. Sancheriv himself didn't die, by the way. Sancheriv went back to Assyria in disgrace, and shortly thereafter he was murdered by his own children who wanted to take over the Malchus. So Sancheriv did not die in this event. Sancheriv was left alive to be a witness to it, and then he died when he came to Assyria. It is said that Nebuchadnezzar, who later became the Babylonian king and world emperor, who destroyed the first Beis HaMikdash, was a foot soldier in Sancheriv's army. And he himself was a witness. He survived. God kept him alive because he had a mission to do, although a mission that was very tragic for us. But Nebuchadnezzar was only a lowly soldier at the time. He later somehow became king of Babylonia, which in turn had conquered Assyria, right? Assyria was conquered by Babylonia. So the notion, I'm just bringing this in just to show that the notion of a celestial army of God was not unknown. It happened in the case of Sancheriv, and Shiras Devorah might be implying, like one explanation, that is what happened with Sisera as well. An angelic army came down and fought side by side with the Jewish soldiers, and that is how Sisera was defeated. Now there is another explanation which fits the idea of the flood. If you remember, Nachal Kishon, the river Kishon, or the Wadi Kishon, right? A wadi is a stream that is dry during the non-rainy months, but then can fill up with water very, very quickly, and sometimes there are flash floods in this area. Now we know, in ways that we don't fully understand, that the position of the stars in heaven affect rain and precipitation. When the Gemara describes the Mabul, it describes Hashem as moving stars around and the shifting of the stars. So according to this explanation, remember that the idea of Nachal Kishain, all of a sudden experiencing a flash flood and creating mud, and the chariots got stuck and people couldn't move and they could be mowed down. What HaKadosh Baruch Hu did was HaKadosh Baruch Hu moved around the stars, creating the precipitation. So according to the second pshat, it is not referring to an army of angels coming down from heaven, but it refers to the rearrangement of the constellations to create an instantaneous mabul that disables Sisera's army, the chariots, creating the mud, and the like. So that could be described as the very stars in heaven fought against Sisera, meaning Devorah is praising Hashem for kind of changing the teva to allow this to happen. Okay, so there are two explanations for the idea that the stars in heaven fought against Sisera. Now then it mentions in the next pasuk how Nachal Kishon swept them up, which actually fits with the second explanation that Devorah is describing a flash flood, which both in terms of the water swept them away and in terms of the mud and the like. And she describes the panic. Again, this is very similar to Kriyas Yamsuf. If you remember, by Paro as well, the Yamsuf split, the Jewish people crossed, then the Egyptians crossed into the channel, and then all of a sudden it got muddy and they couldn't pull themselves out. And there was a sense of panic as they tried to get out of there, as the waters were closing in. Now, granted, this is not exactly Kriyas Yamsuf, there's no Kriyas Yamsuf here, but the notion of panicking as you get stuck in the mud and not being able to escape is very, very reminiscent of Kriyas Yamsuf. Now then, Pasuk Chaf Gimel mentions the one entity that Devorah curses. You know, even the tribes like Ruvain, who didn't show up, she gives them musar, but she doesn't curse them. She doesn't say, let Ruvain be cursed. But in Pasuk Chaf Gimel, we have a curse. And the question is, who is she cursing? Pasuk Chaf Gimel says, Orur is a poetic word for Orur, Meirose, Amar Malach Hashem. That's also peculiar. Devorah says, the angel of God pronounced a curse on Meirose. Okay, we'll see in a moment who is Meirose. Orur Yoshveha. May her inhabitants be cursed. Ki lo bo'u li'ezras Hashem. They did not come to the assistance of God, to the aid of God. Li'ezras Hashem, to the assistance of God, Bagiborim, along with the other mighty ones. So first of all, Chazal themselves remark on the expression, what do you mean they didn't come to assist God? I mean, God is not the one in trouble. It should have said they didn't come to the assistance of Am Yisrael. So Chazal say, when Am Yisrael is in Sorah, the Shekhinah is in Sorah. David HaMelech writes, Imo Anochi B'Tzara. I am with, Hashem says, I am with every Jew in his suffering. So yeah, Kaviyachol, we don't fully understand. Hashem is in distress. Hashem is suffering when Am Yisrael is suffering. And therefore, to put it in the other way, when you help Am Yisrael, you are coming to the aid of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That's what Chazal say. And that's why it's described as Ezras Hashem. Because if Klal Yisrael needs Ezra, Hashem needs Ezra. So, who is Meroz? Meroz is cursed because they did not come to the assistance of God in fighting these enemies. So there is a machlokas in Chazal and among Meforshim. What is Meroz? According to some, Meroz is simply the name of a Jewish city or a Jewish town that was fairly near the battlegrounds. They were not like far away. But they felt that they were safe. They felt they were secure. They felt this was none of their business. And Devorah is cursing, and she's saying Hashem's cursing, the angel of God is cursing, this city, this town, because they simply didn't get involved. Now, a curse, especially one uttered by a Neviah, is a very powerful thing. So one might ask the kasha, well, Devorah already told me Reuven didn't show up, and Dan didn't show up. They don't get cursed, they just get criticized. If the problem of the town of Meroz is they simply didn't show up, why do they get a curse when the other people who didn't show up don't get cursed? Like what makes them extra bad? So one explanation might be because they were closer, meaning the people that are far away, they may have more of an excuse. Meroz was close. Another possibility might be that maybe Meroz was from the tribes of Zevulun and Naphtali, meaning they were the ones who were commanded to come. So unlike the other people, that would be beyond the call of duty, lifnim mishurat hadin, so they don't get cursed, they just get criticized. Perhaps Meroz is culpable because they were of the tribes that were directly commanded. Now, others say, although it's the same pshat, that Meroz is actually the name of a specific person, a very, very prominent leader. And because he didn't participate, he encouraged others not to participate. So the curse is primarily directed against somebody in a leadership position who showed indifference. Obviously, a leader who shows indifference is much worse than regular people who don't get involved, because a leader is mashpia on other people, right? So that's the second pshat. A third pshat is very interesting, that Meroz is not referring to a human being at all, and Meroz is not referring to a city at all. It is referring to a certain kochav, and or a certain angel of a kochav, because Devorah talked about the idea that God manipulated the stars to create the flooding conditions that allowed victory. Well, Meroz was a rogue star. Meroz was a rogue kochav that refused to listen to Hashem's commandments. And therefore she is cursing that star called Meroz. Now, this is not the first time we've encountered this, but this creates enormously difficult questions. of the notion of a kochav or a malach. Human beings have free will. So if God commands a human being to do something, Hashem lets us do it. I can do Averis. Yeah, I'll be punished for it. I'll be held accountable for it. But Lamaisa, human beings are Balei Bechira. And because they're Balei Bechira, they can do Averis. I got it. Actually, it's a miracle, but Hashem lets us do these things. On the other hand, when we think about stars, planets, nature, we normally understand angels. We normally understand that angels are not Balei Bechira. Angels are pre-programmed to perform their specific jobs, and they do those jobs. So the notion that a star, or even if it's the angel of the star, let's say, could simply refuse a divine order would be very difficult, because that would imply that Kochavim, or angels at least, are Balei Bechira. And yet, let me remind you, at the beginning of the Chumash, if you remember, Hashem made the trees, fruit-bearing trees, on the third day of creation. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu said, originally, the taste of the wood should be the same as the taste of the fruit. Meaning God commanded fruit trees. So you could eat the apple, or you could eat the apple branch. It would taste like the apple. But it said the tree rebelled against God. And that's why you have the fruit and you have the wood, because the tree rebelled against God and did not come into existence the way HaKadosh Baruch Hu wanted it to come into existence. Right? That's what Rashi brings, such a medrash. So you're back to the very same question, right? What do you mean? Hashem is creating, in a way that's even worse. Hashem is creating the tree and says the tree should produce a fruit that tastes the same as the wood. And the tree that's coming into existence by God's command deviates. Does the tree have Bechira Bichlal? Right? So it's a very, very difficult Rashi. And the truth of the matter is, there the Maharal explains something a little different. The Maharal explains that even though Chazal used the word it rebelled, but that's just a metaphor, it just means, Maharal says, that Hashem has an ideal plan, but in the Gashmias of Olam Hazeh, you'll never have the ideal. In other words, it's just describing that there's always going to be a disconnect between Hashem's ultimate perfection and the imperfection of physical creation. So it doesn't mean a rebellion as such. It's just a reflection of the fact that Olam Hazeh will always have a certain measure of imperfection and chisaron. It's not perfect. Limot HaMashiach or Olam Haba, whatever, then you'll indeed have the madrega of the wood and the fruit being equal. So that's a good teretz for there. But that's not a good teretz for here, because here we're simply describing Hashem orders the constellations to assume a certain form. And Baruch Hashem, Hashem's plan took place even without Meiroz's obedience. But Meiroz, there's this Kochav Meiroz, or this angel of the Kochav, disobeys. And so in a sense, maybe the flood wasn't as big as it could have been. We don't know exactly what the effect would have been. So you are back to the difficult question, do these things have Balei Bechira? There's a famous word, chess. I don't know if any of you enjoy playing chess. Chess has been part of Jewish history for a very long time. There is a folk tradition, it's not a chazal, there's a folk tradition, which is probably not true, that Shlomo HaMelech invented chess. And yeshiva bachrim always liked chess because it required strategic thinking and roes hanolad, looking at future moves and everything else. So maybe it's an excuse for bittul Torah, I'm not sure, but they usually say, well, chess helps me in my Gemara learning, so therefore it's worthwhile to play chess. But be it as it may, chess was always a favorite game, although some of the chess pieces are frankly Christian symbols, so that's an issue, but okay. The bishop, what is a yid playing around with bishops, but okay. So anyway, so they tell a story that, the Lubavitch Rebbe used to tell the story, that, I don't know if he was playing chess or somebody was playing chess, and the Frierdiker Rebbe, his father-in-law, walked by and said, playing chess, you should be learning, but no, once you're playing, So he was looking at the board and thinking about, this is a good move here, but whatever. So the Rebbe said, the Frierdiker Rebbe said, you got to learn from chess. Everything a Jew does, he has to take spiritual lessons. So what spiritual lesson can you learn from chess? So he said a great thing, a great pashut board. He says, the lowest piece on the chessboard is, of course, the pawn, right? The pawn is lowly. There is no piece lower than the pawn. But only the pawn can be transformed to the highest level, right? When a pawn reaches the other side of the board, the pawn becomes a queen. The queen, there's only one king, of course. The only king is HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So you can't become a king, but you can become as close to God as is possible. No other piece can do that, which means it's the lowest piece that can achieve the highest madrega. And that's an important lesson, because when we ask ourselves, who is holier, angels or people? Objectively, angels are much higher than us. Angels have a very, very high level of kedusha. And of course, within angels, there are many, many madregas. Srafim, Ofanim, the Rambam says there are 10 levels of angels. So take an angel and take a person. The angel is higher than the person. But the potential of man is greater, because man can go from madrega to madrega to madrega to madrega, like a pawn. The angel is static. It's very high, but it can't move. That is why the Vilna Gaon writes, angels are called omdim. They stand still. A human being is called a mahalech, a mover, a traveler. Angels are very, very high, but they're static. Human beings are very, very low, but we can move, right? So the whole greatness of a human being is that as low as we are, we can be transformed by our bechira. Now, what is the reason why we can grow? Because we have the power of choice. We choose. Every time we choose in a good way, we get elevated. We choose in a bad way, we lose those madregas. Angels don't have bechira. So the obvious problem is, if angels don't have bechira, how do you get this rebellious angel? Now, lahavdol, in the Christian tradition, Satan, you'll recall, the Satan is described as an originally heavenly angel who rebelled against God, who refused to accept the authority of God, and was kicked out of heaven. So Satan, the devil, Satan, is a fallen angel who rebelled against God. Once again, that raises the problem of how can an angel rebel against God? Now, let me point out, in our Messiah, that is not at all how we view Satan. We actually view Satan as an officer in Hashem's heavenly court. Look at the book of Iyov. In the book of Iyov, it's describing a courtroom, a heavenly courtroom, in which Hashem is the judge, and Hashem is surrounded by angels who are defense attorneys and prosecutors. Right? That's how we describe the Rosh Hashanah din, that Hashem is going through a judicial process. And the Satan is not a bad guy per se. The Satan is simply the prosecutor. The Satan has a job, and he's up there, meaning the multiple roles, because the Satan is also in fact, the word Satan, right? It's not Satan. It's actually not a proper noun. Ha-Satan is a job description. The accuser. It's not a name, Satan. Ha-Satan, the accuser, the prosecutor, the district attorney. It's a job. Somebody has to do it. Right? Satan's job is to bring out the Midas Hadin. So he's not a fallen angel. He is an angel in God's heavenly court who is given prosecutorial functions. Now, we want to shut him up. Sure, we blow shofar, we do tshuva. We want to disable him. But it's not that he's rebelling against God. He's up there. He's part of the heavenly court. Now, it is true that Satan has other jobs, because Chazal say in Maseches Bava Basra, Satan is not only the makatreg, not only the prosecutor, he's also the Yetzer Hara itself that made me sin. Right? So, in fact, he has three jobs. He is the Yetzer Hara, he is the makatreg, and then he carries out the sentence. He's the Malach HaMavis. Right? So he causes you to sin. It's like those, you ever get stopped, it may be apocryphal, it never happened to me per se like that, but they say you get stopped in these small southern towns in the U.S. for speeding. So the policeman gives you a ticket. Then when you go to court, he becomes the judge. So the cop that arrested you becomes the judge, he becomes the witness against you in front of him, who will decide what your sentence will be. Like he's a one-stop person. He has all the different jobs. So the Satan has all of these jobs. He causes me to sin. He's the Yetzer Hara. He prosecutes me in the heavenly court, and he carries out the eventual death sentence. But still, it's not a fallen angel. So again, I'm digressing in all of these matters, really just to raise the question that if we don't look at the Satan as an angel that rebels against God, precisely because we don't accept the idea that an angel has bechira, who can rebel against God. So we're really back to the problem of this Meirose, that if you give this supernatural explanation of Meirose as a star, or even the angel of a star that refused to listen to God, how does that work? Yeah.
Sorry, two questions. Who was the Meforish who said that Meirose was a star?
Yeah. If you look, Rashi, it's really even from Midrashim, but Rashi brings Amri la kuchva have. Rashi, the pasuk Chav Gimel. Some say Meirose is a kochav. V'amri la gavra chashuva have. V'haya samuch l'makam hal milchama v'lo ba. And others people say he was a very prominent person who was near the site of the war and didn't come. So Rashi's first shot is it was a kochav, or an angel of a kochav. Yeah.
If it were the case that they were obligated to go to the war but didn't, or the person, it would be chayav misa. So why is it that the army didn't execute them, like in the case of Hilagesh?
Yeah, that's a good question. Meaning, if you assume they were obligated to go to the war, so there would be chayav misa. Elamai, if they weren't obligated, then why are they worse off than Ruvain? I understand
the first shot, like, okay, they should have what they did, but they weren't obligated. But if they were obligated, then they should be chayav misa. Why are we cursing them? Why don't we just chayav misa?
Yeah, it's a good question. But again, as I say, so you want to bring a raya that they weren't obligated and they're just being. I hear. Okay. Let me think about it some more. Why they wouldn't be killed if you learned they were obligated? Yeah.
My second question was, in Jewish tradition, isn't there in the Torah the idea of fallen angels, like the Rephilim, weren't they made?
Yeah. So this is another very mysterious passage, and it all depends. If you look at the end of Parshas Bereishis, so it talks about the very mysterious giants that are called the Nephilim. And they're also called B'nai Elokim, the sons of God, the Nephilim, who came to earth, and they abused human women, and they gave birth to children. So what is that? What happened there? So again, in the Christian the Christian understanding of this text, the word Nephilim, which comes from Nafal, so linguistically they have a good case. These are fallen, rebellious angels, and they cohabited, they had sexual relations with human women, and they produced kids. Now, those kids were wiped out in the Mabul. So you are correct that reading the psukim literally, we have these fallen angels, and they're called sons of God, B'nai Elokim, who came down to the earth sinfully and abused women, cohabited with them against their will. However, if you look in Rashi, it's very fascinating that Rashi very, very specifically rejects any type of mystical interpretation of these verses. Rashi says the word B'nai Elokim does not mean angels, and you actually read it B'nai Elohim. Elohim just means powerful people. Powerful people who abuse their positions. In other words, what Rashi is doing is, Rashi is very deliberately demystifying those psukim that they do not refer to fallen angels. However, I got to be honest, if you look in the Zohar and in the mystical Svarim, they actually do, I mean, they don't get it from the Christians, but they actually follow the same approach of fallen angels. So in Kabbalah, there is such a notion of a fallen angel, but I think it's very clear that Rashi was going out of his way not to learn the psukim in that manner. Yeah.
Is there any way to interpret the verse when it says that they came down to earth, to interpret it as alien visitors from another planet?
You know, you're talking about Nephilim in the end of Breitowitz that we just talked about? Absolutely. You know, it's entirely possible that this would refer to aliens. And the only question would be whether aliens themselves are angelic figures. If there are aliens, what would the nature of those aliens be? Sure. This is one of the psukim, one of the sections of the Torah that's very, very mystical, and it can have many, many meanings. The point is that Rashi goes out of his way to drain all the mysticism out of it. And according to Rashi, it just means abusive, wealthy people who treated other people in a bad way. In other words, it's not referring to anybody coming from the sky or the land. Okay, so I'll leave you with this question about, maybe we'll talk about it next week, about Meirose and this notion of the Kochav having the ability to rebel against Hashem. Okay, you'll be well. Take care.